Hello everyone and welcome back to your monthly video on something that isn't an episode of The Games Must Go On. Today I have perhaps my biggest project yet, something that I've been referring to as Redacted since 2021. This project that I have been referring to is a game that I have been creating called Ponpoko 3D. For a little background information, Ponpoko is an old arcade game where you play as Ponpoko himself with the goal of collecting as many fruits as you can while dodging the various snakes and caterpillars in each level. It is also known as the greatest game ever created, well, at least in my opinion. As you can probably guess from the title of the game, my main goal with Ponpoko 3D was to make a 3D remaster of Ponpoko, but saying that I made a 3D remaster of Ponpoko doesn't really put into perspective what went into its recreation, which is why today I want to go over what changed over its creation, what challenges I faced, and how I improved over the creation of Ponpoko 3D. If you're just interested in the game, I have a link to it in the description as well as in the iCard above, so you can check it out right now if you want. Otherwise, let's get right into this with the first big problem I faced, that being I was an idiot when I started. When I started making Ponpoko 3D, my only ever real completed project was my first game called G4C, which was made for the Games for Change game jam, and as you can see, it's not a very involved game, just featuring you picking up trash off the ocean floor like this can of bean. Needless to say, I wasn't very experienced at this point, so starting this project was bumpy, especially since the first thing I would need were the 3D models. I decided the best way to capture the most authentic Ponpoko experience would be to go with a voxel art style. This means I'd be using cubes to capture the pixelated look of the original game. Just because I'm making these models out of cubes doesn't mean it's going to be easy, as there's a lot of models to make. Even for just starting the game with the first level, I have to make a ground tile model, a model of a carrot for the first level's fruit, because yes, carrots are totally fruits, a model of these question mark vases, a model of these tacks, and then some models for the enemies in Ponpoko. It should be noted that one drawback of using voxels is that I can't rig my models, so I have to make a unique model for each animation state. This means for just the enemies in Ponpoko, I have 12 more models to make. As for actually making the models, I decided to create them in Blender, as that's what I was familiar with. I actually decided to design the models in Minecraft. This was just because it was a lot easier to place and destroy blocks than to just shuffle around stuff in Blender. One thing to point out about making the models is I didn't want to make them too thick. While I could have made my models take up to 16 blocks on the Z-axis like they do on the X and Y axes, I decided that they should only be 6 blocks thick. This was because I felt like the depth gave the models enough depth and character without being too extreme. I also felt like this stylized the models more to give them a certain feel. Then again, that could just be me since I've been around them for so long. Either way, with some of the models made in Minecraft, my next step was to make them in Blender, and I would consider this first set of models that I made for level 1 as one of the biggest mistakes and failures in the entire project, as while they did work, they were made in a terrible way. The way I made these original models was I essentially just made various colored blocks that I would copy and paste and then place them into the model. This way of making the models was stupid, dumb, bad, stupid, moronic, idiotic, and probably one of the stupidest things I did in the creation of this game. While I had the excuse that I didn't really know much about Blender's 3D modeler at the time, it doesn't change the fact that these models were failures in a multitude of ways. First, these models weren't really models, but 100 blocks in a trench coat, which means that the game would have to calculate physics data and lighting data for every single block, which takes quite a bit of power. Another thing that was dumb was that I specifically copy and pasted the cubes I was using opposed to just duplicating them with Shift-D. This means that every time I copy and pasted a block, I was actually also making a new material, which also takes more power. Either way, with some of the models created, I decided to start working on the actual game, which started with making the character controller. My first goal was to get basic player functionality made, meaning actually allowing the player to walk, jump, and climb ladders. Because a player can only climb a ladder if there's a ladder behind them, and they can't jump while on a ladder, I also needed to design a state machine. The control scheme was also a little weird because in the original game, the player would do a small jump normally, but if they were holding a direction, they would do a large jump. This was a little weird to implement, but I was able to get it in. I was even able to implement dying, which involves having the player spin out of control as they fall to the bottom floor before crashing. I guess I should also mention another difficult part of the design process, that being using Unity's animation controller for the first time. The animations that Unity likes can be broken into two types, 3D with rigs and 2D sprite sheets. The way that my models are set up, I essentially have a 3D sprite sheet. That's not an option, so instead I have to essentially simulate the existence of a sprite sheet by turning on and off which models are visible or active by hand in all of my animations. This is only made a little bit worse by the existence of exit time. Because Unity still thinks that my model is a rig, it expects the ending point of one animation to not be the starting point of another, so it automatically tries to have exit time to sort of blend the animations together, which doesn't really work with a sprite sheet. But that option can be turned off, it's just a little annoying. All of that being said, with some bad code written, some god-awful models made, and some animations implemented, it was time to unleash version 0.1. Yeah, this is pretty bare bones. I mean, I don't know what you expected. This is version 0.1. The good news is that there's only one place to go from here, and that is up. So let's talk about version 0.2. In this version, I implemented the green caterpillar, which just moves back and forth, making it pretty easy to program. However, I might have been a little too simplistic with its script because in this build it doesn't actually change directions. Another thing that I added though were fruits, vases, and tacks, meaning everything here has one thing in common, that being they all collide with Ponpoko. This introduced something kind of sloppy that I did to determine collision. While enemies have actual hitboxes with box colliders, I had some trouble in the past with colliders not actually registering collisions with other colliders because they were already colliding with something like the ground. To counteract these experiences, instead of giving Ponpoko a box collider and checking when a collision happens, I instead did the obvious thing and just used 4 raycasts in each of the 4 corners of Ponpoko to determine my collision. Even if I didn't want to go with the collider approach, having 4 raycasts was still a bad idea, and I should have instead either used the physics.overlap box method or at the very least a physics.boxcast all method instead of what I did. Another thing that I did was instead of soft locking the player when they died, I now made it so that they respawn, which means this was the birthplace of the unholiest thing known as my game manager script. Either way, in this build, another thing that I did was I made it so the camera didn't move on its own, instead having it teleport between 3 points with the press of a tab key, as I felt like it made it too hard to play the game before, and I would rather have the game be playable before I add too much visual flair. But with that wraps up version 0.2. In version 0.3, I started off by fixing the enemy script so that they actually face the right direction. I also adapted the enemy script for the orange snakes that I also added in this update. Another issue I decided to solve this update was that the enemies were clipping into objects before, so I made it so now the enemies will either move into the foreground or background after getting in range of another object. It should be noted that on the top level both a green caterpillar and an orange snake exist, so I made it so whether the enemy goes in front or behind could be changed manually. Other than the enemies, another thing that started to take advantage of the 3D was Ponpoko, but only a little bit. While before, after dying, Ponpoko would just fall through the floor, now Ponpoko will actually go in front of the blocks to avoid the clipping issue. As more of the fundamentals get flushed out, the updates should get quicker to get through. Case in point, for version 0.4, I added some more interactivity with my game manager by having it send collected fruits to the right side of the screen like in the original game, as well as I made it reset after all the fruits were collected. Similarly, in version 0.5, I added some ground around the objects in a level so that way the enemies would look like they were standing on something when they went around them instead of just floating in midair. However, this version also saw the first dedicated lag reduction segment. While there were dozens, if not hundreds, of optimizations made for the singular purpose of improving the game's performance, and I don't remember every line of code written for optimization, I will try to point out the moderate to major changes I made. One moderate change around this time was remodeling the ground tiles to only be one game object instead of the couple dozen that they were. This is obviously pretty important as there are hundreds of blocks in each level. In version 0.6, I finally implemented the main form of 3D that I wanted, which involved having the ladders propped up against the higher floors that they led to, meaning the higher floors were actually further back than the lower floors, giving the game some actual depth. I also decided to give the platforms a little more depth by having each platform's width be 3 blocks instead of varying amounts depending on which objects were present like in the past versions. For version 0.7, I had to do some more 3D modeling. In particular, because I didn't want any 2D sprites in the game even for the UI, I had to remake the text font used in Ponpoko as 3D models. With the 3D text in hand, I decided it would be a good idea to add the timer to the game and a place for the current player's score, along with an animation of the text appearing and score being added whenever an object is collected. This was actually pretty annoying because while there are text box elements built into Unity, there's nothing for handling 3D text. This meant I had to make specific classes designed to translate a number for score into an actual game object equivalent. As for the non-numerical text, well, I just placed that by hand. One interesting thing about this update is this is where I started to use a static class to hold my data between scenes getting reloaded, so things like the score wouldn't be reset. Version 8 was pretty simple but pretty eventful, as the main thing added were sound effects. While most of the sound effects are still used in the final version, the death sound was hard to get just right and changed a couple of times. The reason it was kind of difficult is because the pitch of a sound actually changes based on how high up you are when you die. As the higher you are, the longer it takes for you to hit the bottom. Other than that, version 0.8 was pretty much just bug fixes. I guess there is another side to version 0.8, that being it introduced a pain in the butt when it comes to making levels. Before this update, each ground tile had its own collider, which would add up to hundreds of colliders all calculating game physics. I decided to fix this by creating ground colliders all tied to one central empty game object. Then I would position these colliders by hand so they overlapped the actual ground. As you can probably guess, this was a painful, tedious process that I would have to do for every single level, in addition to placing all the other objects in each scene. Welcome to the end of page 5 of my script where I can finally talk about version 0.9. Why is this version important? Because up to this point, everything I have done has been in level 1. For reference, there are 20 levels in this game. Version 0.9 is important because it is the update that introduced level 2. Other than level 2 being added, I also added lives, the ability to game over, sending you back to level 1 and losing your score, and I also added some opening music at the start of level 1. The last important thing I did is I remodeled the caterpillar models to be one continuous model. Speaking of which, this is the point in time where I had to make the rest of the fruit models in Blender, and because I didn't want to make them as bad models and then have to remake them later, I decided the first thing I would do is make them as complete models. This honestly killed my motivation, as while I had the models in Minecraft, actually transferring them to Blender was a chore because my understanding of the 3D modeling side of Blender was still so bad. To give a bit of a time frame on when this all took place, in March of 2021 I made my first animation for an episode of The Games Must Go On, which looked like this. Later in May I finished version 0.9. The next day I made all the models in Minecraft. Then, version 0.10 of Ponpoko finished and completed the 3D models, but only actually made one more level, that being level 3, and it came out January 15th, 2022. Needless to say, those 3D models took a lot out of me, and it wasn't getting easier to build levels, as I still had to manually place assets and I had to manually draw out floor collisions on an empty object. But I needed to be like Sisyphus, pushing a Ponpoko-shaped boulder until I reached the top. While I was able to get levels 4 and 5 done a couple of days later for version 0.11, it wasn't until May where I had my next update in version 0.12, where I added levels 6 and 7, and a couple of days later I made version 0.13 with levels 8 and 9. Things started picking up at this point because I decided to ditch the old strategy of making ground collision by hand with one object, instead deciding to put it back onto each floor tile, but in return I decided to abuse a quirk that I had found. Something that I noticed is that the original game works in increments of 2 floor tiles. This means that there can never be a hole of just one tile missing. This isn't even mentioning that even if blocks weren't grouped together in the original game, I already mentioned how I gave each tile 3 blocks of depth. What this means is I could stop treating the tiles like individual objects and more like 2x3 groups, and I went ahead and made a more efficient model to reflect this. Along with the new tile model, I also recreated level 10 and released version 0.14. With my Spirits Eye, it wasn't long until I released versions 0.15 and 0.16, which added levels 11 and 12 respectively. I also made it so that if you press all the keys in the word debug at the same time, you could automatically skip levels, just so I could test the later levels a little easier. Version 0.17 is an interesting case, because while I am trying to keep this remake as faithful as possible to the source material, I decided to change how the jump works. Up to this point, the jump was still either small if you did not hold a direction while jumping and large if you did. In this update, I decided to give the player more control by having Ponpoko's jump distance depend on how long you hold the jump button after jumping. While the argument could be made that I made the game easier, I personally believe that the challenge of a game should come from the game itself and not from a bad control scheme. Other than that, level 13 was added, and the whole project fell apart. While I have been making general improvements to the game's performance, with every update the game's file size kept going up, and version 0.17 was the straw that broke the camel's back, preventing the game from being played in the browser, instead requiring it to be downloaded to your machine. While this may seem inconsequential, I felt like the game needed to be playable in the browser or no one would care enough to play it. Out of everything developing this game threw at me, I think giving into defeat and making a Windows version of version 0.17 is what took the most out of me in the entire project's lifetime. While there probably were some small improvements I could have made to make it fit into the 200 megabyte requirement for WebGL applications on itch.io, I still had 7 levels left, and each level seemed to take up a bunch of space. Needless to say that this was another thing that caused me to step away from the project. After a 6-month hiatus, I came back to fix my code. Knowing what I know now, this probably wasn't necessary, as I'm pretty sure the exorbitant file sizes were because I didn't have the right lighting settings, as I was mostly using baked lighting, meaning I had large light maps that were taking up a lot of space. So I probably could have just fixed the lighting settings and everything would have been fine, but that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, fixing my way of level generation was still a good way to improve the game and a way to speed up the creation process for the other levels. At this current point, all the levels were made by hand, which is kind of a pain because every object had to be manually placed, which was annoying because everything had a unique offset. For instance, the offset of a ladder is at the bottom of it, while the offset of a fruit is in its dead center. Because of the tediousness of making levels by hand and the storage size issues I was facing, I decided to entirely redesign the way I was making levels. The new way I designed makes creating levels a lot more intuitive and a whole lot faster. The way I decided to make this new level generator involves 3 steps. The first step is that I made a hazard script. Because the script doesn't actually have any methods, instead just holding information, it honestly would have been better to just use a struct, but I digress. The hazard script holds 3 pieces of information: how far the hazard is from the last hazard, an enum representing the hazard type, and an int for miscellaneous data depending on what hazard type it is. The second step was to design what I call blueprints, which are honestly just game objects that have a lot of hazards attached to them. And the last step was to design a level generation script to use the blueprints to actually build the levels. There were 2 big caveats to this system though. The first is that I had to integrate this level generation script into the game manager script, and let's just say going back to view old code from 2021 showed how much I improved. But that's of course only because a lot of the formatting in my old code was absolutely abhorrent. Like, look at this method name. Why did I make it this way? Well, I guess it's just because I hate the universe. Sure, why not? Anyway, there's just one other itsy bitsy teeny weeny little bitty problem. You know how I already made 13 levels? Well, they're completely useless now. I have to remake all the levels from scratch in the format of blueprints. The good news is that it's a lot easier to enter in values to make the blueprints than to manually move things, so it wasn't too terrible. That being said, version 0.18 came out on December 11th, 2022 with this new level generation system and a couple of other new features. One change I made is to the camera. I decided to make it so the camera's position changes depending on Ponpoko's movement, having it rotate side to side when you move left and right, and having it move closer and higher as you climb up. Another small detail I added that I had wanted for a while now is that after dying, instead of just hitting your head, now you actually explode, and I did this using Unity's particle system, which was my first time really using it. From here on out, I decided to add one more level to the game for every new update I had. This way I could focus more on the missing features of the game while gradually adding content. Speaking of missing features, let's talk about bonus points. In Ponpoko, you get bonus points by beating levels quickly, which isn't really a problem as I already have a script managing the timer. The problem is that normally you're taken to a black void to see your bonus score. If I were to implement this, I would have to make a screen transition between levels, which would screw with my level generator script and my game manager, and I did not want to mess with that. Also, it would needlessly add load times for something that didn't really need it. That's why instead, I just decided to keep it in the same scene. This creates another problem though, as having a giant piece of text appear would probably be pretty jarring. As such, I decided to have the bonus score fall from the top of the screen after beating a level. I even added a little animation of the text bobbing up and down after it reaches its intended position. Another big part of this update is that I added background decorations in the form of these falling cubes. At this point, I thought the generic black screen was too boring, so I decided that the background objects would help spice it up, and what better object to use than multicolor versions of the floor tiles. This didn't go off without a hitch though, as I didn't feel like making this too complicated yet, so I decided to make the background with Unity's particle system. This came with two big problems though. The first is that I can't have multiple models, so another idea that I had for a background of raining fruit would have to wait. The other big problem is that I had to reduce the number of cubes that spawn to prevent cubes from spawning too close to each other. This was all in an effort to prevent clipping. Needless to say, this wasn't perfect, but it could be improved upon later. The next update was for version 0.20, and while not much was added in terms of gameplay, I finally fixed a problem from version 0.1. While over time I had remodeled my block models into singular objects, one thing that I hadn't touched yet was Ponpoko, mostly because of its 8 separate animation states. In this update though, I've bit the bullet, and I went ahead and remodeled every single Ponpoko model. Other than Ponpoko, I also decided to remodel a couple of other objects like the tack and the blue border surrounding the game. Another thing I did in version 0.20 is I made the timer a little more interesting by having each segment crumble apart when it runs out instead of just disappearing. Version 0.21 includes a minor change that took a decent amount of effort, that being adding the title screen along with a small cutscene that happens if you wait on the title screen for too long. The way I decided to implement this was the same way I decided to use my level generator. At this point, I had learned about the benefits of structs, so I decided to use an array of cutscene event structs that would be constantly looping in a cutscene manager. Each cutscene event would have a delay time from the last event, an event ID, and an object to affect. I needed to include which object would be affected because the cutscene involves having several Ponpoko clones move and stop at various times. With a bunch of commands implemented, it wasn't too bad to make, but one tedious part was that because I didn't have a text generator for my 3D text, I actually had to write the song in the cutscene by placing the letters manually. At this point, I confirmed what types of score I wanted to be present in the game. The original game has a player 1 score, a player 2 score, and a top score. If I emulated these to a T, the game would face the same problem an emulated version of the game faces. That being, there would be no competition because everyone would have their own personal leaderboard with nobody else on it. I decided to remedy this by having slightly different scores. The player 1 score would still track your current score, however because I wasn't going to include a 2-player mode because I already hate my game manager and I would die if I tried to implement local multiplayer, I decided to change the player 2 score to a local best score, similar to the top score you would see in the actual game. As for the top score in the remake, I decided that to create competition, I would have it hold the actual top score, gotten through an online leaderboard so that way people can compete for it just like in an actual arcade. While the idea for what I wanted the score to be was set in place here, the only thing I actually made in this update was the local score by using player prefs for the first time. Unfortunately, implementing the score would have to wait as on the title screen I made the space button lead to the game, but I also made the tab button lead to the options menu, which is a problem because I don't have an options menu, so that's a pretty crucial thing to tackle for version 0.22. Some good news is that the options menu wasn't too bad to implement, as while using a grid system didn't really work due to all the options not being the same size, by giving each menu item a reference to the elements around it, the menu creation went pretty smoothly. The hard part of this update was what the options actually affected, as while camera sensitivity was as simple as adding a variable in an existing equation, the active backgrounds were a problem because now I actually had to make them. For this update, I decided to include 6 backgrounds, so I'll go through them from easiest to hardest. The easiest background to make was the null background, and this is because it's quite literally nothing. This is just in case people don't want the background distracting them. The second background is what I call a fruit mirror. This is because it's a giant fruit that changes depending on your current level, and it mirrors your camera rotation. Overall, this one wasn't too bad. The next one was the Ponpoko mirror, which not only is a giant Ponpoko, but I also made it mimic your movements. This was a little annoying to do due to the fact that not all the animations I made turn on and off the Ponpoko models like the typical 2D sprite animations. Instead, some physically rotate or scale the models, such as the death spiral that you go into after being hit. The last 3 backgrounds are all types of rain, including cube rain, fruit rain, and a combo of both. Like I mentioned before when I made the cube rain, while Unity's particle system can be used to have a basic falling simulator, it's not perfect. As such, in this update, I made a separate script to simulate it. This seems really easy because I just have to instantiate objects at random points, but like I mentioned with the particle system, I don't want the objects to clip into each other, and in order to ensure that no clipping occurs, I have to do a few calculations to determine not only how far the objects have to be apart, but also what possible sizes the objects can spawn as. This is only made more annoying because I can't use the scale part of the object's transform because the cubes and fruits have different sizes. Nevertheless, I was able to figure it out and I finished up the backgrounds. In addition to the backgrounds, I decided that it would be a good idea to make the last 4 levels in a game. While I had been making them at a rate of 1 per update, like I said, I decided that because I was going to be making the online leaderboard next time, that it would be smart to keep the levels the same from then on in order to make the leaderboard fair. That being said, that wraps up version 0.22, meaning it's time to add the last important feature, an online leaderboard. In order to make a leaderboard, the first thing I needed was a server to store the values on. For this, I decided to use Loot Locker as they provide free servers until your game has over 10,000 active users. And for some reason, I believe that there aren't 10,000 people who are certifiably a gamer enough to play Ponpoko 3D actively. One thing that was a little scary was that the SDK for Loot Locker was meant for newer versions of Unity, and the version I was using was from 2018. As such, I had to update Unity and hope nothing that I made got corrupted in the update. And considering some of the hack job code I had made, I am genuinely shocked that it worked without breaking anything. After downloading the packages needed to run LootLocker's API and experimenting a little bit, I had everything set up to receive scores. Sending scores was a little trickier though, as I wanted to recreate Pompoko's leaderboard style with the added spot for people's names. First of all, I finally had to cave in and create a text generator that can write text with 3D characters, since it was kind of necessary if I was going to allow unique names to be entered. The next thing I did is I created a script that would allow players to enter their names by shuffling letters around by hitting up and down like how you would enter your name in a typical arcade machine. This wasn't too difficult, but it was more just a new control scheme that I had to implement. But with that and a bit of testing, the online leaderboard was ready to go. This means that Ponpoko 3D was finally ready for its full release, and as such on January 27th of 2023, version 1.0 was uploaded. This is basically the end of the game's development, although I did make a few revisions to the game's leaderboard, such as allowing the player to type in their name instead of just having the arcade interface, just to make life easier. So yeah, Ponpoko 3D is complete. Go play it! The game is free on my itch.io page and there's a link in the description. This is only the start of the infinite games I'm going to wand into existence, so you can expect more games as I continue improving. But before I end off this video, I want to thank Retro Gaming Loft for letting me use his footage of the original arcade game version of Ponpoko, and a link to his video can be found in the description below. But with that, if you liked this video or Ponpoko 3D in general, please think about hitting that like and subscribe button below. This video took a long time to make considering the whole, game making process, so I'd really appreciate any support. But with that, I would like to say thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Goodbye!